And we are live. Ohio State has seemingly salvaged their basketball season on the brink of not even making the tournament per Ohio State beat writers of credibility. I'm Luke Zimmermann, joined by Matt Brown. As always, after a one-week hiatus for the holidays, Land Grant Holy Lands, Hangout in the Holy Land, the 7th episode. We're back for 2013, back and better than ever. Excited Ohio State, looked the part. They looked more like themselves. Granted, they were playing maybe an equally uneven to their own previous performance team in the form of the Purdue Boilermakers. Matt Painter's got a young group, but a talented one in that. The two Johnsons just are guys that can get the ball and score with it. But, for all Ohio State's supposed fatal flaws, they certainly look like a team capable of making some noise in conference play tonight.
Yeah, I mean, look, I don't think Purdue is likely to be an NCAA tournament team this year, but given how we've talked a lot about how hard it is to win on the road in the Big Ten, I think if you get a nice 10-point victory over probably a fringe team that's definitely talented enough to beat a lot of squads in the Big Ten, you got to take it. It's great to see Aaron Kraft stepping up his offensive game. It's great to see the team dominance, rebounding, and really just a chance to get that horrible taste of that boat race on Saturday out of everybody's mouth, so we can kind of maybe step away from the ledge a little bit, realize that this is probably not a team that might lose to Nebraska or Penn State on a regular basis, and we can kind of find a happy medium with their expectations.
Yeah, and a couple different things. What are your thoughts on just this weird phenomenon, which has now sort of been recurring, where anytime anything goes bad, we find the paid professionals like you and I are, really a volunteer army that do this as a labor of love. We're not making any money. We're not getting rich off this, but we've got folks out there that their livelihood is covering Ohio State and trying to keep perspective as level-headed and intelligently as possible, freaking out about, just not showing up. I mean, that's the one thing with bowl games to me, and this is a bit of an aside, I apologize, but like Notre Dame is not as bad as they looked against Alabama, nor is Alabama as good as they looked. And the same thing goes for Illinois. Illinois is not as good as they looked in beating Ohio State by 20, and Ohio State is not as bad as they look in the lackluster performance. But it seems like for all the chicken littles out there, wearing Ohio State press passes, Doug Lesmerises from the Cleveland Plain Dealer kept the most level head throughout the event and then after. And, he said, I think before tonight's game, that Ohio State will have games that look like they did against Illinois. They'll have games like they did where they looked against Duke in the first half. And Purdue is just not good enough to beat Ohio State on a consistent basis. And even at, it's Mackey Arena is never an easy place to win. I mean, really just especially if you look at this Big Ten slate as a whole, like how good the league is this year, how challenging the scheduling is. And the Buckeyes, I think, get a favor by only drawing Minnesota once. Correct me if I'm wrong, but
yeah, and that's at home too.
Yeah, so that's favorable. But there's just every game. There's no nights off, even against the Penn States of the world. All right, there is a night off, and it's called Nebraska night. But Nebraska aside, the Big Ten's 12th member, until Rutgers joins and kind of takes off some of the pressure, there's no easy nights in this league. I mean, it's hard to almost fathom, given just how boring and slow and the Wisconsinization of the Big Ten from 2 to 3 seasons ago. But it's come full circle with these short one-year recruiting cycles. It's almost more like JUCO ball now, where you load up for 1, maybe 2 seasons, and you do the best that you can when guys leave.
Yeah.
But that's where we're at with major college basketball, and at least in the interim, man, it's terrifying to say, and we'll talk about it here briefly, but John Beelan up at Michigan may have the deepest team in America, and they're arguably the best team in the country right now. Ohio State's going to host them on the heels of the 74-64 victory over Purdue. Big recruiting weekend too. We'll talk some recruiting in a more meta, I guess, high level, 30,000 feet perspective here in a second, and some topics that interest us. But any thoughts on how Ohio State will fare against the Wolverines?
It's going to be tough. I think Ohio State's going to have to extract every little bit of home court advantage they can get there. Michigan has looked really outstanding in almost every game they've played, but I don't think, even though they had a couple of nice victories in the preseason NIT in New York, they haven't played a team that I think is anywhere near the caliber of what potentially Ohio State can be. So I think that they might come out a little bit flat when they're trying to adjust to the Ohio State's ability to defend on the perimeter. I think we'll look at that in a little bit more detail. I want to touch a little bit on what you were talking about earlier before with the perhaps jumping to conclusions. I think that's a little bit easier when we lost the Marquette game, the Washington game that I think looked a lot better on paper, and now Washington's probably not really that good. And so we've had so many of these games where Ohio State is so completely overmatches their opponent, and we're not paying that much attention. I think it's apparent that maybe not everybody on the court is paying attention if we listen to what Amir Williams is saying or what some of the other guys are. And the only other two benchmarks that Ohio State has had have been two close losses. I mean, granted, Duke and Kansas are two of the 5 best teams in the country, and there's hundreds of teams that would love to play both those teams just closely. And then, so the first game we have against an Illinois team that maybe some people thought might have been a little bit overrated, to lose that badly, just comparatively, I think seems a lot worse than it actually was. And maybe if there had been a couple of other games beforehand to kind of recalibrate expectations a little bit, or get a better idea of what Ohio State's capable of, then that wouldn't have appeared to be the disaster that it seemed then.
No, agree wholeheartedly. 2 quick things I want to touch on before we shift gears to our other major topic of the night, something we wrote about on the site this afternoon, or rather yesterday afternoon when this thing goes live tomorrow. Before that, one thing I read on Twitter during the end of the Purdue game was another hot sports take from a paid Ohio State professional beat writer, saying that in order for Ohio State to maximize their output this season, their success is contingent on Aaron Kraft, the offensive playmaker. I think you and I have talked about this offline, as I see you pulling your hair out and possibly having a hemorrhage or a stroke.
I might have just had an aneurysm right there.
30 to 60 seconds, tell me why Aaron Kraft does not matter to Ohio State's prospects long-term from the offensive scoring perspective, at least.
I think this is just such a lazy hot sports take. I mean, I think that really assumes that the only way that a player can impact or effectively impact the game offensively is by shooting the basketball. Yep. Aaron Kraft is probably Ohio State's second best offensive player, even if he doesn't take a shot outside of a couple of free throws, because his extremely good individual on the ball defense is going to create so many turnovers or wasted possessions on the other team that's going to set up shot opportunities for Ohio State to score in transition, which is good since OSU is not really a great jump shooting team. It's going to be excellent because it takes points off the board for the other team defensively, and because Ohio State's probably not going to be able to outscore that many teams. And Aaron Kraft is exceptional at setting people up for easy baskets with his passing. He's good at just about every other facet of even rebounding for a guy that's not that big, except for jump shooting. So to look at that and go, oh, well, I don't know if Aaron Kraft can consistently hit that 12-footer, or I don't know if Aaron Kraft can hit that corner 3 that I expect a college point guard to be able to make. That, and he's not the guy. Like he's so good at everything else. It doesn't matter. Like if you want to pick at the guy who needs to step up offensively, you point to Sam Thompson, who's needs to be able to do things other than just dunk. Or point to Lenzel Smith. Point to
Lenzel Smith was a venerable non-factor in this evening's conference. Maybe his worst offensive showing of the entire season.
Not good. Now he had 10 rebounds, so he was still finding a way to impact the game in a positive manner. But yeah,
well, I meant the
shooting not so good
perspective.
Oh, but, of course.
Nonetheless,
basket making.
Real quick before we move over to our next topic, Michigan game against John Beilein, number 2 ranked Michigan, and those 3 talented Big Ten freshmen of the week that they've had in, I think, consecutive weeks, which is crazy. All 3 were different guys. How does Ohio State fare? Bumper sticker me.
Bumper sticker. Right now, I think this is kind of a tough matchup on paper, because I think Michigan more than well, more than anybody else, I think in the Big Ten, Michigan has a chance to, even if their interior defense isn't spectacular, or even if they're not rebounding spectacularly well, they can drop 85 points, even on a team that I think can defend the perimeter as well as Ohio State. They're just so good at shooting. They have size. They can play inside. You can have Tim Hardaway and Glenn Robinson's kids just rain it from 3. So I think not only would Deshaun Thomas need to have an exceptional game of himself, but somebody else is going to have to be able to come in and drop 16, 17 points and hope that we can ugly it up just enough to hang with. I mean, if Michigan scores 80 points, I think.
Super bold early prediction, and by the way, that was a I think limo-length bumper sticker. But nonetheless, I think that this could be a game that hinges on the likes of like a LaQuinton Ross or somebody like that is going to have to step up just to answer the sheer depth of offensive options that Michigan brings to the table. Trey Burke, like you mentioned, Glenn Robinson III, Tim Hardaway Jr. I mean, these are guys that any one of them, I mean, they're not always consistent in terms of scoring the ball, but if any one of them gets going and a second one gets going, Ohio State can quickly find themselves in a hole. Anyway, we were with this topic today on the site, which maybe by the time this thing goes live tomorrow morning will have become more and more commonplace on the internet, but we were one of the first to talk about it. John Infante, the immortal bylaw blogger himself, hit it not long after us, following our lead, but some interesting proposals at the American Football Coaches Association's annual 2013 convention some prospective NCAA rule changes that were floated by the NCAA. And for the NCAA to be presenting these publicly, I mean, this might just be my opinion. I don't have too much of an inner knowing of how these things work, but for them to present to the coaches like this is almost more of like a get ready, these changes are coming, than a, hey, we're thinking about doing these. But changes are really interesting. They streamline the process much more in line with the changes they made for basketball, which are considered radical. Unlimited phone calls, unlimited text to players, moving the deadline up from their senior year, I think July 1st their senior year, to July 1st their junior year. So now all of a sudden we've got recruiting beginning a year earlier. No early recruiting period so far, which some of the skeptics of this, you and I have concerns just naturally about, how this impacts the ability for smaller market and smaller conference teams to compete. We worry about the playing equality functionality or I guess multiplier effects of this radical rule changes. But the other major concern is that there's not an early signing period like they have for basketball where you can sign preemptively, but it's binding. So now we're just going to still have these long 2-year cycles. Other changes include going from 7 coaches recruiting at all times to 10. So you'd have Ohio State's entire staff from, the defensive backs coach all the way to Zach Smith on wide receivers. Everyone would be out on the road all the time, as many minutes as they possibly could.
Of course.
Still limited in terms of the number of times you can recruit kids, and that doesn't change. The last thing that might be really dramatic, and I might be missing one or two since there were about 7 or 8 different proposals, but another big one was the notion that you'd be able to almost have, in terms of like the materials you can give the kids, they would be almost seemingly limitless. So you could bombard them with even more paper and more promotional info to try and get the kids to sign than ever before. And I know there's one other on the tip of my tongue.
Well, there was the other thing that we hit a day or two before about potentially getting rid of the 1-year waiting period between transferring.
No, that's huge, and I was definitely going to talk about that. I remember what the last thing was that was kind of slipping my mind. I've got too much Big Ten basketball in my head to shift gears back to football recruiting. But the other thing was the ability to hire a support staff that can contact the kids directly, which right now is not the case. You have to have a full-time coach. Like Mark Pantoni is like probably on the periphery of the current rule. I mean, I think in terms of Ohio State's limits, he counts as a coach for Ohio State because Urban Meyer realized how important it is to have a guy like that. But with this rule change, you'd almost be effectively creating a de facto general manager position that Pantoni and those like him would be supervising an entire team of Pantonis. You'd have, potentially, I don't know if there's a limit on the number, but you'd have all these different folks representing Ohio State, all trying to get recruits into the fold. And, when the coaches are doing coaching things that aren't just, calling kids. And, I saw a tweet today, I can't remember who it was from. I think it was Kyle Berger, the offensive tackle prospect, where he's just like, I love talking to Coach Fickle. It was like the weirdest thing in the world. It was like reading, MySpace or Zanga or something. Yeah. But when you don't have these coaches trying to woo these kids, you'll have these support staff members wooing kids. And I know Infante, in his response to our piece and to the ESPN Recruiting Nation piece that originally talked about the findings from the coaches conference, said that he felt that this wasn't a disproportionate factor. He thought, in terms of the ability for these smaller, mid-major so-called schools to be able to compete, they'd still be able to hire the same number of people. I think it's down to a quality thing, though, because money talks. Like, even right now in the SEC, one of the defining reasons why that conference is the premier conference in the land is the amount of resources they invest into their coaches. Imagine SEC teams investing another $3 or $4 million into just a secondary support staff, like 10 more de facto recruiting exclusive coaches. Like, that's just mind-boggling.
Yeah, I if I understood his argument correctly, I think he was a little bit skeptical necessarily of the ability to just flat out buy more recruiting power. Like, oh yeah, okay, so now you can send out a gajillion flyers, but
right.
will that necessarily move every recruit? But I think if you look at this in conjunction with perhaps the change from a couple of days ago about eliminating that
proposed change.
The proposed change. No, that's right. Proposed, but all these are proposed changes. Yeah. I think all of these, like in conjunction, could definitely potentially be a really big landscape shift that will benefit the Ohio States, the Texases, the USCs, the SECs, people who have the capacity to not just hire a lot of people, but a lot of really good people. And if you're an Akron, I think that means it's going to be it's just so much more important for you to be able just to target a limited number of people, make sure that you get those guys, knowing that if you have to compete with any other bigger school, it's going to be that much harder. to
Well,
really
I think the
in.
point that Infante also made was that this might produce more Moneyball scenarios where these teams have to
Yeah.
almost change their methodology. So the recruiting landscape is the same, but resource wise is obviously grossly unequal. And so what these teams may do is they may start focusing on cultivating younger and younger classes since the deadline is getting moved from their senior year to July 1st of their junior year. You might have like teams like Florida International, coached now by Ron Turner, former Illinois coach, who I think was like 44-64 in Big Ten play. You fire, the most successful coach in your admittedly young program's history, Mario Cristobal, who Miami will gladly swoop up as the new wide receivers coach and assistant head coach and recruiting coordinator or whatever his title is going to be. They replace him with this guy, but nonetheless, you'll have schools like Florida International, North Texas, New Mexico State. These teams will build these classes. They might have 10 or 11 recruits that are from 2-3 years down the road, like the youngest they can possibly be. Because if you go to a kid that hasn't gotten an offer because Ohio State, is too busy focused on the class of 2014, and let's say Akron might be a bad example, but I'm trying to think of a Midwest equivalent. Yeah, maybe Akron or like a Bowling Green or a Kent State. Maybe they're offering, instead of 2014, they're offering 2015 kids binding offers. You might see them try and get some of these, and that's still not entirely different from how the system works now. You see these smaller schools, like we interviewed this kid Jacob McCrary, who's an Ohio State offer. He's considering basically every good school under the sun, but a lot of his early offers, like I was looking at him, it was like Louisiana Lafayette, and it's because the kid's only a junior and he's just now into the stage where he's I guess able to start making contact with these. Maybe he doesn't have formal offers, but regardless, like his situation is that he's a bit younger, right? And so he's getting these offers. I think maybe now the system is after your freshman or after your junior year is completed. I don't know. I don't have the bylaws in front of me, so my legalist memory might be failing me. But nonetheless, he had a ton of early offers, or at least early interest. Maybe offers to come visit or camp with or whatever from like FIU, Arkansas State, and I think that's how they get them now. Maybe that system won't change. I'm not sure.
I think that's how like 1AA or Division III or smaller schools do it too.
They offer really early.
Yeah, going after kids as soon as they can, maybe before they realize that they could potentially be like a fringe D1 talent to go get the Capitals and the Denizens, the smaller schools, to just start barning that guy as soon as they can. Mm-hmm. So yeah, it'll definitely be interesting to see. I would be a little bit surprised, I think, if all of the proposed changes that we're hearing about now are signed in exactly as they're being proposed. But I think we're going to see some significant changes. And if that means streamlining some NCAA regulations,
that's not a bad thing.
No, like anything I think that can help out compliance departments. I mean, for state schools, there's a lot of expensive paper pushers who are having to go check the United States Code of NCAA regulations to try to go follow through with everything. Mm-hmm. And if we're able to cut some of that stuff out and leave the NCAA resources to punish the most egregious offenders, then I'm all for that.
Let's open up NCAA resources so they can spend more time with 5- and 6-year reviews of the Cam Newton affair. Now I'm just joking. Let's give them more time and money to be even more inactive than they already are. All joking aside, I think the thing I was thinking was I think you can offer kids maybe whenever, because we know that Lane Kiffin has offered like 8th graders and 7th graders and ridiculous stuff like that at both Tennessee and USC. I think that they can't maybe make official visits, or you can't have like in-person contact at their school or in their homes until after right now July 1st of their senior year. So they can make unofficial visits and you can offer them, because those offers are obviously non-binding until they sign the piece of paper. I still think an early signing period would matter a lot. I don't know why coaches are necessarily so much opposed to it. It might be something I have to do a little bit more research and maybe write a little bit about once I find out more about it. But nonetheless, very interesting time in college football if these rule changes are enacted. I can't imagine the unlimited phone calls and texts. Like, these kids should be like, getting burners and destroying their phones, because they're just going to be harassed nonstop. Because like the coach from Kansas, the offensive line coach, was like, well, if we don't do it, Kansas State will. So they're going to have assistants calling these kids every single day. And just, and these coaches too, like they already work, 18, 19-hour days. Now they have to have another like hour or two a day making phone calls. Anyway, stay tuned for the site. We'll certainly have more on this stuff as it unfolds. If it becomes legislation, we'll definitely talk about it. And if any other interesting radical proposals come from Mark Emmert's desk, potentially impact Ohio State, we'll do that too. Big day college football playoffs get lined up with, I think, the Sugar Bowl and the Rose Bowl will be the first two semifinals. The Cotton Bowl is the favorite to be the first national championship game. 2014, Ohio State potentially defending their national title from this year, right? Anyway, tons of stuff going on. Big recruiting weekend, like I said. Michigan, Ohio State, number 2 undefeated Michigan. The game, basketball form, should be a big chance for Ohio State to potentially maybe reclaim their name, and maybe once and for all they can prove to certain writers that they will make the NCAA tournament.
If we can beat Michigan, I think we're probably going to be at least a 9 seed.
At least a 9 seed, maybe a 1 seed in the NIT if all else fails.
Oh.
Anyway, I'm Luke Zimmermann, joined by Matt Brown, Land Grant Holy Lands, Hangout in the Holy Land, Land Grant Holy Lands podcast. Go Buckeyes.
Go Buckeyes.